Hello everyone, welcome into this edition of Vinyl Voyage, where we go through my record collection and go through music history and teach you a little bit about some of the things that were happening in music at the time of these releases. So this is the Bob Dylan, the original mono recordings. This is his first 8 albums on Columbia Records, of course. This particular version is pressed at RTI, which is sort of a fancy record pressing plant. I mean, it's a little bit more expensive to get pressed at RTI. So this is kind of a premium box set in a way. And as it says, it is mono. So it is not a stereo pressing. It is just the same in both speakers, basically. But we'll go through a little bit of Bob Dylan's career and talk a little bit about the folk legend. So let's set sail. As I stated before, Bob Dylan is a music legend known for his distinct voice, his clever songwriting and arranging, and of course his harmonica playing. He was born as Robert Allen Zimmerman in Duluth, Minnesota in 1941, but spent most of his childhood in Hibbing, Minnesota when his father got diagnosed with polio. He had to get medical treatment, so they moved to Hibbing, Minnesota. He would frequently listen to the radio, and he clearly had a passion for music at a very young age. He formed bands and performed Little Richard and Elvis Presley songs. I would assume that was what everybody was listening to in the 50s. I wasn't alive then, but I assume that was the big names in the game. The real turning point for his music career, however, was his decision to move to New York in 1961, where he visited Woody Guthrie, who was in the hospital for Huntington's disease at the time, but he said that visit inspired him. So because of that visit with Guthrie, he was inspired to start performing, and he didn't take him long to start performing in Greenwich Village in New York City. But we'll get into his albums now. Bob Dylan is his debut album, self-titled here, with his guitar. They put it on this side because they didn't want the Columbia logo covered up. It's basically the only thing I know about this particular album cover. It was done very on the cheap. He was not a commodity at the time, and so they didn't spend a lot of resources on him. This album was released in March 19th of 1962. The album was produced by Columbia's legendary talent scout, John H. Hammond, who had earlier signed Dylan to the label, a decision which was at the time controversial. He met John Hammond at a rehearsal session for Carolyn Hester, an early 60s folk music singer. He played harmonica on that session, but was later asked by Hammond to have a formal audition and to later be signed by Columbia. He got a little recognition in a small-time paper called the New York Times, of course. They wrote a little piece about his performances with Carolyn Hester. After that, he signed a 5-year deal with Columbia Records, and the rest of the records we'll talk about is a result of that contract. Of course, this is the first 8 of his albums, but those 5 were what he signed on for at the beginning, and it didn't go over well. This particular album was not received nearly as well as they hoped. This album was recorded in 3 short days and costed Columbia about $400 to make. Most of the tracks were recorded in 1 take. I think the quote that Bob Dylan had about that, it only taking 3 days, "I can't see myself singing the same song twice in a row." The album only has 2 original tracks, Talkin' New York and Song to Woody. And the Song to Woody is a tribute to Woody Guthrie. It's folk standards that he would hear in when he was working the New York strip there in Greenwich Village. And a lot of it, you wouldn't expect that he would be the folk icon that he was later on by this album in particularly. This album didn't have any critical acclaim to the release of this album. It got a little bit more as it grew older, but as the music grows older, the heart grows fonder. It's probably his most overshadowed album because every album following this was so critically acclaimed. Although my standout tracks on this album is Man of Constant Sorrow and House of the Rising Sun. If you don't know House of the Rising Sun, you haven't taken guitar lessons, because that's like one of the first songs you learn. I picked those tracks because it kind of showcases his arranging skills. He worked out his vocal limitations in an interesting way. He would always record a little bit more uniquely than everybody else. Like since it was one take and he was doing it so raw and uncut, it was, it was a little rough around the edges, and that's what made Bob Dylan so endearing to people, I think. And that's why he was able to stay, and other folk musicians were kind of lost with the time. It only sold 5,000 copies at the time, so this was considered a complete flop for the producer and Columbia at the time. But they didn't spend a lot on it, and they didn't put a lot into it, so I think it did all right for what it was. But next, we got the big political album, or as what people would call the political album, Freewheelin Bob Dylan. This is his second album. It came out in May of 1963. It was big in many ways. It featured 11 original songs, and it was the beginning of Bob Dylan's peace anthem songs. Because the album opened up with Blowin' in the Wind, an integral part of the peacekeeping 60s. With the fear of nuclear war in the back of everyone's mind, this song was sort of an anthem for the peacekeeping movement. I would say the songs I think of on this album is I love Don't Think Twice, It's Alright. It's a little bit sappy, but I like it. Girl from North Country, which he later re-recorded with Johnny Cash for the Nashville Skyline album. This album is considered his first great album, and also deeply political, with Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, a direct response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Susie Rizzolo is the girl on the cover, and that's big because she inspired this album. She was very politically minded at the time, and this really inspired Dylan to write politically charged music. 22 was where it placed on the US charts, but in the UK it debuted at number 1 and eventually went platinum. And it was clear that Bob Dylan was here to stay, and that his cult following was growing, and so was his mainstream appeal. I feel like Britain was on the forefront of knowing what was going to be popular before it was popular, and the U.S. took some time to get there, but we got there with the popularity of Bob Dylan. And this album was huge, especially for peacekeeping war anthems, I guess. Now we move on to even more acoustic Bob Dylan gloriousness. The Times They Are A-Changin. This is the third album, of course. It came out in 1964. This is the first album to only feature original songs, the songwriting by Mr. Dylan himself. The Times They Are A-Changin did not do as good in reviews and critical acclaim as the following release. But I think this is my favorite of the early acoustic Bob Dylan, I would have to say. I feel like he bears his heart a lot on this. One thing I really like about this album is the epitaphs that are on the back here by Bob himself. And usually they put this in the liner notes, this kind of stuff in the liner notes, but it's pretty cool and unique that this is on the back of the jacket here. I think that's kind of unique and makes this album stand out. When the Ship Comes In is probably my favorite track, and the title track is absolutely the most popular from this album. It's been used in a variety of different movies, and I think it's made some very good cinematic moments, The Times They Are A-Changin. It's amazing how this song continues on due to its simplicity of the production, with Bob Dylan solo and no accompaniment, with Tom Wilson producing. The track that does seem the most emblematic of the current time period was With God on Their Side, which is the song Dylan takes you on a journey through history, saying that while many systems of government that had God on their side had good intentions but were toxic to many people that they were trying to help, but ended up being negative in the whole course of history. It basically gives you a history lesson, and I know I chose it as a song that I needed to do for a history project, because It does. It gives you a pretty good lowdown on the history of bad regimes and what people with too much power can do to the lower man. But the times they are changing. Bob Dylan came out in 1963 or 4. Excuse me. Next, we got another side of Bob Dylan. This is August 8th, 1964's release. Bob Dylan said about this album name that it was a little cheesy. He felt like, yeah, it didn't sound like anything I'd recorded before, but it was a little cheesy to call it Another Side, because people thought, many contemporary music critics at the time had thought Dylan has lost in touch with the people, because he didn't really write any politically minded songs on this particular release. It's the thematic shift that really got him the flack for this particular release. While the other albums before had a clear push for peace and humanitarian causes, this record is more simplistic in themes dealing with relationships, like in the opening track, All I Really Want to Do. Chimes of Freedom is also another track on here that stands out. At 7 minutes in runtime, was probably the most memorable song on the album, because an album with the same name came out in 2012 as a charity album for Amnesty International. It was previously unreleased recordings of famous figures doing Dylan songs and the man himself for charity. Although this one seems to be the most forgotten of early Dylan. I don't know. It does feel like it is the black sheep of this particular box set, because you don't have the Mr. Tambourine Man, you don't have the song, the Blowing in the Wind on here that everybody thinks of when they think of Bob Dylan. So it's a little bit of the black sheep, but it's still a good album, and I do love that the lyrics on the back and the inner sleeve, so you know that you're going to get the lyrics every time. Of course, this is produced by Tom Wilson, and it was the same deal. I mean, he didn't have an accompaniment yet, so there's not a whole lot to the music production-wise, but it's Bob Dylan. All right, bringing it all back home. This is a big one, mainly for the fact that on side A, Dylan went electric. I mean, he didn't do any electric albums or any electric songs or any accompaniment really in any of his previous recordings. But on this one, on side A, he goes all out with an electric guitar and a rock and roll backing band. And then on side B, we get, the typical Dylan with the guitar and stripped back production. Side 2 was the classic acoustic driven ballads. Side 1 was an amalgam of electric guitar with subterranean homesick blues to start off the track list, with its iconic music video with the cards that he holds and changes as the lyrics change. Although this album is remembered as the first since his Beatles influence and his first to have a backing band, also the first to showcase the electric guitar, this is the first album of Dylan's to chart in the top 10, number 6 in its debut in the U.S. Mr. Tambourine Man was left out of Another Side of Bob Dylan and put on this album. I guess he thought, okay, I have better songs to put on this, might as well keep one of the best ones for this. not that he probably did that, but this album was also big because it's around the time that Dylan met the Hawks, who would be his backing band for subsequent performances and recordings. Around the time between this album and the next, he made his first public performance at the Newport Folk Festival playing electric for the first time, and drew ire of his very die-hard fan base that didn't want to hear Dylan play the rock and roll music that the Beatles were playing. They wanted to hear peace and protest ballads, as Dylan was commonly referred to as the spokesperson of the young people at the time. That Newport show will be remembered as probably one of the more controversial performances in rock and folk history, but it also stands out as, a lot of people didn't want him to be electric or sell out, if you will, but it just goes to show that Bob Dylan wasn't going to be painted into a corner or made to be I have to be this genre. I have to be this folksy hero to create music, the music I love. And, at the time, it sounded like there was a lot of boos and everybody wasn't really feeling it, but the band really thought, I think they just wanted more of what we were going to play for them. I don't think it was really because they were so opposed to electric, but it was a big jump for people that really liked his music. Bringing it all back home. Highway 61 Revisited. A month after his performance at Newport, where Dylan went electric, Highway 61 Revisited was released in August 30th of 1965, widely regarded as Dylan's best album, period. His sixth studio album featured what many considered his best song of all time, which was Like a Rolling Stone. Listed as the greatest song ever by Rolling Stone magazine. No bias there, I assume. In the top 500 songs. He named the album Highway 61 Revisited because of the highway that connects Dylan's home place of Duluth, Minnesota, to music capitals like St. Louis, Memphis, and New Orleans. This album hit third on the Billboard 200 charts. Getting into the music, the album sounds the most bluesiest out of all of his albums, of course, because mainly it was all stripped back before this, other than bringing it all back home. All the songs were recorded with a nice rock and roll band accompaniment, members of the Hawks, as we mentioned before, and a few session musicians that he wanted people to play along the way. This is the first album that Dylan recorded completely electric, except for the 11-minute outro, that is Desolation Row. And that was, again, classic Dylan, stripped back and low production. This album is very big for me. I would say that it's probably my favorite Dylan album. If I had to pick songs that stood out, it would be Tombstone Blues, which, with blues in the name, it's got to be bluesy and catchy, so that's a great song. And, of course, Queen Jane Approximately, Highway 61 Revisited. You get the little that's always pretty fun to hear. But it featured Alan Cooper on organ and piano, Paul Griffin, Bob Gregg, Harvey Goldstein, Charlie McCoy, Frank Owens on piano, and Russ Savakis on bass. But Highway 61 Revisited, produced by Bob Johnston. Great album, and one of the best albums of all time. This could be one of the best albums of all time, too. Blonde on Blonde, if I could get his head up right. A gatefold. What would you expect in a double album? And this is pretty cool because this is one of the first double albums. It kind of sees a return to rock and roll for Dylan. Released in June of 1966, this album is one of the first double albums of all time in a 72-minute runtime. The album peaked at number 9 on the U.S. charts, and the two singles, Rainy Day Woman number 12 and 35, and I Want You, were on the charts. Fun fact about the album cover, this is the first, it's the first of 3 albums where he wore this particular jacket, which cracks me up. He wore this one for Blonde on Blonde, John Wesley Harding, and his other release, Nashville Skyline. It cracks me up that that's the jacket that's on those other covers. There's the man. Great cover. Iconic cover. I Want You, Just Like a Woman, Absolutely Sweet Marie. Those are the tracks that really stand out to me on this particular release. This album is a nice sweet spot between his acoustic, slow, balladized stuff, driven style, and also his electric accompaniment and like a leopard skin pillbox hat on this particular album. I feel like he kind of hit a nice amalgam of both of the genre styles. But it's Dylan, so he's his own genre. You can't go wrong with harmonica solos, Robbie Robertson's guitar playing from the band, as we mentioned before, and Dylan's classic writing style, of course. The album's recording took place in 2 different sessions one in New York and one in Nashville. But the one in Nashville turned out to be more fruitful. They got a lot more content out of the Nashville session musicians and less out of the New York style. But that blonde on blonde sound would continue to kind of shape Bob Dylan's production for the rest of his career, in a way. It's very influential, and it was listed as number 38 of the top 500 albums of all time. But I love this album. Good songs. Alright, so the last album we'll be talking about today is John Wesley Harding, which is named after an outlaw, an Old West outlaw. I mean, it's spelled wrong. It has a G on this, and the actual dude's name didn't have the G. It's just Harding. All along the Watchtower. That's basically all you need to know about this album. that song is so huge in rock history, so that really stands above all the songs on this particular record. Well, this is where this episode correlates to the band episode, because Bob Dylan was recording with the band all of this year, pretty much. This came out at the tail end of '67, but he was recording and doing the basement tapes with the band in 1967 in that big pink house that we talked about in the band episode in New York, in West Socrates, New York. This came out on December 27th. He was heavily influenced by his recordings with the band at the time, but he did not use any songs from those recordings. Instead, he recorded all of these new original songs. I don't know how much more proof of the talent of Bob Dylan that you need, that he was working on songs the entire year and wrote like so many songs, like 6 hours of songs, and then he goes into the recording studio to release another album, and he all new material. He's just like, let's throw it all out. Even though I had great stuff, let's throw it all out and start again. This album was pretty well received at the time of release. It made it to number 2 on the U.S. charts. All Along the Watchtower is the big standout, and was recorded 1 year later by Mr. Jimi Hendrix, and he made it a lot more popular than Dylan did, but, you know, Dylan was the first, so there's something to be said about the originator of a certain piece of music. The record was named after the outlaw, of course, and the self-titled song is about a certain gunslinger, so he did actually write a song about the gunslinger. I do think this is one of Dylan's best storytelling albums, with songs like the Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, and I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine. Pretty killer album, and the last of our first 8 recordings at Columbia, and the last that we're going to talk about today. I appreciate you guys joining me on this episode of Bob Dylan. I mean, his first 8 albums are probably some of his best material. I don't think he ever really got up to that status on any other record. Blood on the Tracks was pretty big, and that was in 1975, so we're almost 10 years down the road. He would have a bigger release, bigger than these. But yeah, I would say that these are probably the albums that people think of when they think of Bob Dylan. These particular early recordings, these first 8 albums. And also, I would say, I don't think he ever got to the peak. I mean, Blood on the Tracks was good, and Desire was good, but these are when I want to listen to Bob Dylan, I always come back to these early Columbia recordings. So, as the box set, I would have to give it a pretty good rating. A few pressing issues, but you know, that's just nitpicking. Also, what's cool about this release is it's got a nice little booklet of photographs and certain things that needed to be profiled in this particular era of Dylan's career. Great black and white photos. I might get some overhead shots of these, but thank you guys for joining me on this edition of Vinyl Voyage, and listen to some Bob Dylan. Why not? I know his voice is a little niche, that people don't really like his voice, but you know, go ahead and put in like a Rolling Stone. You can handle that one. Thank you.